Hi, and welcome to this AI in C# video on the Microsoft Agent Framework. Today we're going to cover every single agent setting you can make on an agent in Agent Framework, down to the very small bits of it. It will be a high-level overview because a lot of these settings requires its own video, which is already in the channel, and some of them are very, very obscure. But I wanted to cover everything so you have an idea on what level of settings you can actually set. So let's jump into it. There are 4 places you can configure your agent. You can configure it when you make your provider. There's certain things that you can set, like timeout and stuff like that, but not really. It's for the calls, not the agent themselves. Then you have all the agent settings that you can set. There's 2 overloads when you say as AI agent, and we'll cover every single thing that is possible to set there. Then we cover middleware, where we, after our agent, can put some more configuration on it. And finally, there is, when we actually call the individual call, there is some additional settings that we can set. Not that they are too important, but they are there. At the end, I will also show how all of this is done using Agent Framework Toolkit, and it will explain a lot why I made that NuGet package to make this easier. Because what you're about to see is a very, very deep dive down to a very big rabbit hole of settings within settings within settings that can be intimidating if you need to do something advanced. But let's get into it. So the provider settings, they are fairly simple in that you can make various different providers. Here I'm doing an Azure OpenAI client, and in that we of course give the basics like endpoints and API keys, but then there is a client options where you can set things like timeouts, retries, and so on. I won't go into every single one of them because they are different from each of the providers, Azure, Anthropic, Google, and so on. Timeout is definitely one of the ones you will normally do if you have some very, very long calls that takes more than the default timeout in .NET. Often you will also see that providers that are not the big frontier labs like Anthropic and OpenAI, that they use the OpenAI client and then give the endpoint, for example, here to OpenRouter, but could also be XAI and so on and so forth. So every single one of these options inside the providers have additional things, but it's mostly about retries, networks, endpoints, and such like that. Moving up to the main part of this agent settings, we have options to make our agents from absolutely no settings to endless amount of settings. So if we want to have an agent with no settings, the only real setting we need to set always is what model we are going to use. But if we do something like this will actually work. It will just use the stock, in this case GPT-5.6 Luna, to have our agent, and it will not answer in a specific way. It will not have any tools available or anything. And in the same manner, if we do it using Responses API instead of Chat Client, we do more or less the same, but the model needs to be set on the AI agent instead of the Responses client itself. Small details. In real life, you will at least set model, instructions, and tools. And that can be done fairly simple here. So you put the model in, of course, you put your instructions, which is your prompt engineering, and you put in your tools that this agent should be allowed to call. So in some cases, you can have this as enough. I tend to also work a lot with reasoning efforts. So there we need to go a bit deeper. And unfortunately, that's not on this level. One of the reasons why I also made my own, which we'll look at the end. But for simple tests and things, these are probably the three most ones that you're going to use. But we need to be able to set more settings. And there are two options when you say as AI agent. You either get this with some parameters, or there's a dedicated option object. I would say this one can't really be used for too much because, as you can see, we can set our instruction tools just like we did. But beyond that, we can set a name, which is just display, and description, which is also just display. So whenever an agent is called, you can get its name out if need be. There is something for Client Factory, which makes the iChat client to be changed. I personally never used this. I used the option I'm going to show in 1 second. But here we can go in, for example, and set breathing effort. I think it's a bit too difficult to set like this, but it is a possibility if you just want quick and dirty settings. But I don't really like this approach. Also, if you want to set logging, you can do that. In here, we set a console log here with various logging. I would say OpenTelemetry is probably better than just custom logging, but it depends on what you need. And there is a setting about sending in a service provider so you can do dependency injection in tools and other objects. I have a dedicated video for that, but essentially it's just if anything your agent is ever going to use needs dependency injection for some reason, it is possible to send in your service provider. But this is not the one I'm really going to use, or when I use it like this with those three only. I don't really set anything beyond that here. But what we can do is we can use the chat client agent options. This is the second overload when we have as AR options and where we give a new options object in. And this one have much more than what we have here. And I feel like it's always worth going that route unless you have the very, very simple stuff, because then you can expand without needing to change. There's a bunch of options in here. Some of them are very, very handy. Some of them are very, very obscure that I, in my, let's say it's now 10 months of using Agent Framework, I've never ever used. But let's go through them. First up, you can give your agent an ID. If you need it to store in some way or anything, it's mostly for display. And if you don't give one, a GUI will automatically be assigned. But it is possible to give it an ID so you can reference it. Same way you can give it a name. Again, it's optional and display only. And a description, which is, again, no practical effects, only the description that you can bring up. Then there's something called AI context providers. This is a place where you can incept before and after LLM calls. I have deep dives into that in another video. But essentially, you can go in, for example, and say before the call, let me change what instructions should be there, what tools should be there, and after, extract what was said and turn it into memory and stuff like that. But again, dedicated videos about AI context providers, because else we would sit here even longer. The same goes for chat history provider, where we can use the in-memory chat history provider out of the box. We don't need to set it. It will happen automatically, or it will make one of the providers that is from the underlying client. So for example, Responses API have its own system for storing history. You can make your own, and you can build you can go in and build custom ones that store it into other data stores and stuff like that. Again, I have a dedicated video on that. One drawback when using the chat client agent options is that instructions and tools are actually in a sub-object called chat options. So chat options is the underlying options from Microsoft Extensions AI, which Agent Framework is built upon. And in order to set them when we use this one, we actually need to new up this new chat options. It's really annoying that these are not out here. So it could have been easier, but that's the way it is. This chat options have a lot of other options, so many in fact that it couldn't fit on this screen, so I will show them in the next screen. Beyond that, there's a bunch of obscure settings. And to show that fact, exactly one of this one here, has this entire description on how it works, what it is about, and so on. These are so niche that I have never ever had a use for them. But it's mostly around the chat history manipulation. If we need to clear it, if the provider also have a chat history, should it warn if there's multiple, should method injections happen into chat history, and so on. I would say if you these are only things you will end up setting if you log a issue on their GitHub repo and the team comes back and say, for your specific scenario, you need to do this, this, and this, and set this to true and this to true. In real life, you're probably never gonna use these unless you have a very, very obscure scenario that you need to set. So don't bother too much about these. If you need them, you will know already what they're about. Beyond that, for some reason, these three extra settings that we also had on the previous one over here, so client factory, logger factory, and services, are also in this one, which is kind of strange because this one affects this one. And there's a bunch of things that makes it a bit different because it's on various different levels of options. But they work exactly the same, so we won't go into details. I would have liked if these were inside the chat agent options, but that's just the way it is. Again, you rarely set them. I promise that underneath this we have the chat options. So let's go in and see what they can set. And they can set a bunch of options itself as well. So we're really going down the rabbit hole now. So as mentioned, the instructions are here, the tools are here, and fairly recently an abstraction of reasoning has also come here. This has not really become a standard yet. The frontier LLMs, Anthropic, OpenAI, Google are slowly getting into that it needs a reasoning effort, low, high, medium, and so on, and what kind of reasoning output that should be. So Microsoft Extension AI, which is providing this, have built an abstraction on top of it, but I don't really trust it yet. And for example, there's not a max level of effort, which some of them can do and others cannot. So I tend to do this in the provider specific settings that we will come to in one bit. But it is possible to get it a little further out now instead of needing to go even one layer deeper in order to set reasoning effort. Then there's some rare and often provider-specific things, like for example max output tokens. Max output tokens is something Anthropic models need, but none of the others need it by default. But it is possible to say this is as many tokens as you are allowed to provide me when you give your response back. So it is a standard, but only Anthropic's required as default, else the others just go to. I can use whatever. In a similar manner, if the underlying system that you have built have never asked for the model, it is possible in chat options to finally give the model. Here, it is sometimes needed with Anthropic, but others give it upfront, so often not something you need to do. Then we have response format, which is tied to structured output. If you don't know structured output, you should definitely see those videos about that. Response, but I've still put it in rare here because this is where you go in and tweak the response format. You specify a schema for the structured output yourself in a more custom manner. We don't really need to do that in Agent Framework because we have the run async generic version, which on the fly builds this response format up for us. But if you needed for some reason to build some very, very advanced response way, and you can't for some reason use run async, it is possible to use the response format here. The final one I put in rare is tool mode. Tool mode is where you can actually control how the LLM is being instructed of what it must do with tools. The default is auto, meaning that it's allowed to either call the tool or not, depending if it feels it's okay or it needs to. You can set it to disallow, but then you could argue you just don't give it tools, so you don't really need that as well. And finally, you can go in and say it needs to at least call one tool every time it calls, which is again also a kind of odd setting. So it's very, very rare that you want to do this. It should probably be some setting that you say, for this time, don't use tools or something like that. Then there's some obscure ones, like allow multiple tool calls at the same time. Normally, when an LLM comes back, it only says, I want to use this tool. Then it goes back and then will ask for another tool and so on. But you can say true that it's allowed to do that. I have not seen any of the models actually do it in real life, so I don't think it's kind of normal to do. But you can control if it should be allowed or not for some reason here. And there's two options for allowed background responses and continue token. I have a dedicated videos about these two, but it's about if you have a LLM call that takes lots and lots of time, you can actually defer the call, say, go work on this, and then I can sit on Paul to say, is it done yet? Is it done yet? And so on. Again, I have a dedicated video on it. Then a bunch of settings I normally don't use. Additional properties, for example. Additional properties is described as if the LLM needs this, you can send this as well in a key value store. But in real life, it tends to not be in that structure anyway. And I have never ever seen some of these. I've tried various options, figured out that it didn't work. And so it's not the solution most of the time. It's more this raw representation factory down here. But you can try to set them, but I have never seen any real value in it. Then there's the conversation ID. You could argue that it might be up in rare and not obscure, but you can get the ID of the conversation, and then you can have the LLM continue the conversation if you give a previous conversation ID. For that, we will normally use the chat history in Agent Framework. Then there's seed and stop sequence, which I have never used any of those two. Seed should, if you know seeds from games and other things, so things are repeatable. So it's like mat.random, where you can put in a seed, so it will give reproducible results. But if you read closer on seed, it's actually not guaranteed because we are dealing with LLMs here, but it will try as much as possible to give reproducible results. But in real life, it's not really happening. Stop sequence is all about you can set in a list of words that should stop any processing. I can't really see why you would ever do that, but it is there. Then you can see there's 5 settings here, all being of type float. That is, I call them old settings now, because these are classic one was temperature, where you set temperature to 0 to get more reliable responses, but it's all about non-reasoning LLMs. And nowadays, none of the LLMs are non-reasoning. Everyone is a reasoning model now. So things like trying to manipulate these often result in an exception from the model, depending on which one you call, or just being ignored. So I don't see in any way you need to set any of these. The final one is something called Raw Representation Factory. And Raw Representation Factory is just an object here where you can give the provider level settings that you need for example, Google or OpenAI and so on. So this is where you set all the other settings that are not yet standard in AI. Reasoning was one of the big ones in the past, again, slowly getting into a standard, but service tiers, caching modes, and stuff like that, you haven't seen here, and that's because you need to set them on a per provider level. So we need to go one step deeper into the rabbit hole, and that is the raw representation factory. So, for example, if we use OpenAI's responses API, we can set the response raw representation factory to a create response options, where we can then begin to set the reasoning options and the service tiers and so on and so forth. If we go chat client, it's a different option object. So you can see raw representation factory is different objects from time to time. So there's different ways of setting them. Gemini have a different way where it's a generate content config with thinking config, and Anthropic have a message creation params where you need to set the thinking params and so on. So whenever you end up with something that you can't find, it's probably down in a raw representation factory here in order to set the various options that are provider specific. So you often find, so these objects here, they are directly from the NuGet package of Anthropic, Google, and so on, and not part of Agent Factory itself. But it can take that and serialize it and put it on into the call on the fly. Moving on to middleware, we won't go into middleware too much, but middleware is when we have our agent. Before now, we had only defined our agent, but now we have our agent, and we can say as builder and then use various different things until we build. So it's a little like normal service providers when we build our app and say use authentication, use authorization, and so on. But it's just for the agent. So we can go in, for example, and have various .use. So they have 5, 6 overloads on this. The one you probably want to use is tool calling middleware. So you can actually make a small middleware method here in order to grab details about what tool is about to be called or stop the tool. Perhaps. Again, dedicated video on how to do that. You can also use other versions of this. Mostly they are covered by context providers instead. Because the AI context providers can also be defined here, but only message-based AI context providers. Again, covered in the AI context providers deep dive video itself. But essentially, you can go in and say on the fly, add some message injection to your system, more messages for an LLM to know RAG information, and so on and so forth. For some reason, you can also define the logging here, which you could already in the definition, but you can also put it onto the after the fact here. So I guess it's because you can make generic agents and then put different logging into each one of them if need be. So also here you define OpenTelemetry. I have a dedicated video on that. And they also have things for tool approval. So for example, if you have tool approval where the user needs to say, I approve this tool, I reject this tool, and so on, you often also want something to, I approve this tool and don't ask me again. This middleware helps keep track of such things. I tend to let an LLM call the tools without any approval, so I haven't really used it too much, but it's there if you need it. You can also build your own middleware. It's just an object with an extension method on if you need to do something special in your agent. Apply name and description automatically, whatever you want. Then we have the call itself. And I know this is getting long, but luckily the call, while it looks menacing, you have 18 different overloads when you do run async. It's mostly about how the different messages are being sent. Is the message being sent as a string? Is it sent as a chat message? Is it sent as a list of chat messages? Or is it even sent or because the session takes care of it? But there is options for serialization and options for extra options here. But what we will see is that in essence, it's very, very simple. You send your message or one of the overloads with either just a string, a chat message. Chat message is a good way of doing it if you need images and PDFs because it can have additional content, or a list of messages if you don't want to use agent sessions, meaning previous turn conversation. So you can either use the agent session, which is the chat history, or you can just send the list of the entire conversation as a list of messages. Then the user said this, then the agent said this, then the user said this. So you don't need to use sessions in order to have a continued conversation, but it is possible. And then we have the options, but luckily for us, all of these settings are exactly the same as what is on the agent. So if you define them on the agent, it means every single call will do it. But there could be scenarios where on a specific call, you don't want to use a specific setting, you want to use a specific setting. So it is possible to, again, change the client, the chat options, the client factory, and they are put out because these are fairly, makes fairly much sense on the call itself to allow the background responses and continue token. So it is possible to set all these settings. In real life, you often don't do this because you just make different agents to do different ways of calling, and those agents will do the same every single time. But it is possible to override most of the settings on the individual call level if need be. That is all the settings, and as you can see, there's a lot of them, and they are in various different levels that you need to set. And for that reason, which annoyed me a lot in the beginning, it has become slightly better, but it's still setting within setting within setting. I think you can get 4 levels deep or something like that. So for that reason, I built Agent Framework Toolkit, which I have other videos about. But essentially, it's just a NuGet package that are more opinionated. So you go in and make a factory, which is an Azure OpenAI factory, or an OpenAI factory, or a Gemini factory, and so on. And once you have one of those, you get create agent, which has a set of options. And here, all options is, as we just seen, is here. You can set every single one of them, but they have been weaved into a single options object. So no object options within options within options. Everything is joined in here, including the middleware that will on the fly apply to you. So you have only what makes sense for Azure OpenAI, only what makes sense for Google and so on. So service tier is here directly for OpenAI because we are an Azure OpenAI agent. For Anthropic, it will require the max output tokens, which is you else need to go in and set within a setting, and so on. So it's just a different way of doing exactly the same behind the scenes of this create agent. It does exactly what we have just seen, but it's just in a one single object because there is so many deep layers in the original settings. But that's everything. That should make you able to do every single one of these. The ones I've talked about having its dedicated video, of course, if you need to dive even deeper. But now you know what every single setting can do. So thank you for listening and see you in the next one.